Thank you. We're so delighted to be having you in this very full house today. It's clear that the debate on carbon offsets and carbon markets is one that you all must be having with yourselves if you've showed up. And it's one that we've been having with ourselves as peer authors of the Oxford Offsetting Principles for about 2 years. Moderating and running this session is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce the director of our Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment. Professor Meta Morsing is not only a great scholar, a leader in the sustainable development and climate management studies, she's also our director coming from a background in diplomacy, working in the UN, working with business schools. Meta comes to us with a mission and a vision that suggests that academia can never sit behind the walls of the ivory tower and twiddle its thumbs. And so introducing us today on this panel about what is possibly one of our most impactful pieces of insights work was something that we thought we would invite her to do today. Meta, thanks so much for kicking us off.
Thank you so very much, Kaya, for this warm introduction. I appreciate it. Colleagues, friends, and guests, warmest welcome to an exciting debate at Oxford University in the beautiful Oxford Martin School here today at the launching event of the revised Oxford Offsetting Principles. My name is Mette Morsing, as Kaya has firmly and friendly introduced me to, and with the Oxford Martin School and the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, we are thrilled to host you for this actually sold-out event for the great carbon market debate, Is It Over for Offsetting? We have about 158 of you in this room, and we have 400 registered online. So just to say and reinforce what Kaya has already said, there's a great attention and a great interest to understand and to debate this offsetting into the future. And a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, who I will introduce in a moment. The debate is being recorded for you to know and streamed live, so hello and welcome to all of you out there and all the viewers online. To set the scene, getting to net zero has become an unequivocal global goal with targets across the majority of the world's largest businesses and by governments at every level, but there remains much debate about how to get there. The issue of offsetting sits at the very top of the list of debates as to how to reach net zero. And we at the Smith School have been challenged by our advisors in a very good way and our business fellows to engage with controversial topics, exactly like this one. Universities have a unique role to play by bringing neutral, evidence-based insights to debates, helping to clarify difficult concepts, and of course, to teach. We also have a role as a trusted convener of different views so that they can be heard and debated from different angles. And we're also part of the proud Oxford tradition of debates. The famous Oxford Union Debate Forum was founded 201 years ago in 1823. And we will practice that a little bit here this late afternoon. So we're very excited to be hosting the debate here today. And in 2020, we released for the first version of the Oxford Offsetting Principles. And this flagship guidance, I think it's fair to say, on guidance on credible and net zero aligned carbon offsetting has been used by hundreds of organizations since its first publication. And we now have an estimate that since 2020, it has been downloaded about 30,000 times. It's by far the most read document on the Smith School website. But a lot has changed since 2020 in the science and the landscape for offsetting. And today we have released an update to these principles. And after nearly 2 years of internal peer-to-peer debate over Oxford's principles, we thought we'd bring the debate to you, to the public. The updated principles represent a consensus among an interdisciplinary team here in Oxford, but the debate rages around the world, as you will know. And on this panel, we have both academics and practitioners to help us answer the question, Is the era of offsetting over? And do we need offsets now more than ever? So first, to help us frame this question and to give a kind of a common platform, we will have a brief opening from one of the lead authors of the Oxford Offsetting Principles, Inge Johnstone. So Inge leads a new research program focused on offsetting and finance within the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. She is an enrolled barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand and in the final stages of her PhD at Victoria University of Wellington. Her research focuses on conceiving net zero as a source of new legal norms and delving into their substance, including how they can promote the environmental integrity of carbon markets. So please help me welcome Inge Johnstone.
Thank you so much, Professor Morsing, and distinguished guests. So we're here today because we have a maths problem. Some back-of-the-envelope calculations suggest that today, humanity pumped out in the order of 100 million tons of CO2. At the same time, we sucked down 5.5 million tons. And we know that to reach net zero, what we put up must come down, and it must come down so and be stored durably. And as a result, we know there are two key levers as part of this net zero equation. We must both reduce emissions and we must both scale removals on the other hand. And these are both core to a net zero aligned offsetting strategy. But before we speak more on offsetting, it's important to acknowledge that our maths problem has real consequences in the real world. So talking here from Oxford in February, we may not be immediately aware that we have reached any kind of temperature record, but indeed we have. So the last 12 months was the first time that we have consistently averaged over 1.5 degrees in recorded history. And we also know it's not just heat, it's extremes of all kinds that are aggravated by climate change. So what's clear, whatever side of the carbon market debate that you sit on, is that we urgently need more climate mitigation, and that offsetting strategies are one key lever that we have to do so. So what is offsetting? Well, offsetting at its core is a way of compensating for emissions of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. Now, the most common way actors do so is by purchasing carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market, which equal 1 ton equivalent of CO2. Now, while we call it a market, really the voluntary carbon market is actually made up of several different marketplaces, such as Vera or Gold Standard, who issue credits based on their own methodologies for projects which either avoid, reduce, or remove emissions all across the globe. Now, just in the last few days, I've run the numbers on the full year of 2023 market data from these registries, and in some circumstances would wager that carbon market financing is indeed the only thing that ties together animal manure management systems in China with water filtration systems in Kenya. Now, this type of emission reduction project is where we see the largest volume of projects out on the VCM. This also covers things like renewable energy. It also covers disrupting gases such as methane or HFCs. But actually, the projects issuing the most amount of credits out on the voluntary carbon market is avoided emissions. So these are projects such as REDD+ or avoided grassland conversion. And these rely on payments essentially to protect already kind of intact ecosystems. Now, the smallest category, which is interesting because it's often what people think of first when they think of the voluntary carbon market, is removals. And so this could be conventional removals, such as planting a tree or managing forest ecosystems better. It could also be novel removals, such as direct air capture or biochar. So it's clear we have an array of different projects out on the voluntary carbon market today, which in turn produce credits that have different qualities. But quality itself has also been a key challenge on the carbon market. And so I'm here to frame some of the aspects of that we might hear tonight. So we've had carbon markets for several decades, and in that time, it's fair to say that they've proven quite a controversial mechanism. And fundamentally, I think it comes down to whether we view that their use, especially to offset, has actually helped or hindered our progress towards the Paris Agreement. So in 2023, the combination of these projects resulted in about 200 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent of voluntary retirements across the largest registries. So if you remember the figure right at the start, this very roughly translates to about 2 days of our global carbon emissions. So it's clear that they have a role to play in mitigating climate change, but there's still some really key issues that I'll walk through. So first, additionality. Would the project have already occurred in absence of carbon project financing? Indeed, had it already happened? Was it already mandated, for example, protecting an already protected forest? Was it already economic? Was it installing renewable energy when that already made the most business sense? Durability. If carbon is stored, how robustly is it stored? Is there a risk of leakage? And this could be both economic leakage or physical. And are there measures in place to address these kind of risks and reversals? And perhaps more importantly, whose job is it to actually monitor that the carbon is being stored, and whose job is it to replace that carbon should it be released? Methodologies are also key. So we have to question how robust the methodologies underpinning these carbon credit estimations actually are. And crucially, how these methodologies are then being applied out on the ground, especially when estimating these kind of counterfactuals or the kind of what could have happened. Transparency. So a significant proportion of actors that either buy or retire carbon credits do so anonymously, meaning that a lot of offsetting strategies are by definition quite opaque. And as a result, we might not know who it is that has bought a very cheap credit from 2013 and is trying to use it against their 2023 climate target. Similarly, tracking. As I said, there's no one singular registry issuing carbon credits, and we need some robust accounting and accountability mechanisms really to ensure there's no double issuance, claiming, or counting of these carbon credits. Third-party validation and verification is available to help address some of these concerns, and there's increasing technology from satellites and the like to assist us in this endeavour. But it can be expensive, and it can result in less of that financing actually flowing through on the ground to projects. There's also sustainable development benefits and risks. Every project that we're talking about here tonight has impacts beyond carbon removal or reduction or avoidance, and these can be enormous and include the alienation of Indigenous peoples from their lands and other human rights abuses. And claims. What kind of claims are being made off the back of these investments in carbon credits? So how credible are they? Now, despite these challenges, we have an enormous need to scale climate mitigation, and especially the novel kinds of carbon removal I've already mentioned, which may need to be scaled as much as 1,300 times by 2050, as estimated by the 2023 State of CDR report. And market mechanisms could have a lot of potential to do this scaling. And I'm really excited that the panelists tonight will be exploring both the risks and rewards of this as we move forward. But before we get there, it's important to say too that these aspects of the voluntary carbon market, both its risks and rewards, were the inspiration for the original principles back in 2020. And in the course of the revision over the past few years, we've even grappled with the question of whether offsetting is still a responsible term to use in 2024. As it has been used and abused, as we have seen various scandals illustrate over the past few years. But in retaining the term in the revised principles, we really want to emphasize the distinction between status quo offsetting strategies and what a truly net zero aligned offsetting strategy looks like in 2024. So in that spirit, I'll just briefly introduce the 4 principles. Principle 1, cut emissions, ensure the environmental integrity of credits used to achieve net zero, and regularly revise your offsetting strategy as best practice develops. So this involves, firstly, reducing your value chain emissions to minimize the need to offset in the first place. Now, reducing emissions has its own co-benefits. This could be cost savings, it could be reduced air pollution, but it's also crucial because we have a limit to high integrity credits. These credits, if they are used for offsetting purposes, must be measured, reported, verified, and correctly accounted for. They must also produce additional climate mitigation beyond that which was already going to occur anyway. And crucially, they must avoid negative impacts on both people and the environment. And finally, these principles need to be revised regularly and disclosed to ensure that transparency, and again, to come back to avoid that kind of double counting, double claiming, and ensure the credibility of these claims. So this is principle 2, transition to carbon removal offsetting for any residual emissions by the global net zero date. This comes back to our maths problem right at the start. So we need to be pulling down from the air what we are putting up. But at the same time, we need to ensure that what we're storing, what we're pulling down, we're doing so durably. And this is housed in Principle 3. Very simply, carbon needs to be stored on the same timescales relevant to climate change. Otherwise, we'll have overall done very little to affect the temperature signal we're putting up. And finally, Principle 4, which is support the development of innovative and integrated approaches to achieving net zero. As might come up tonight, we know that the supply of carbon removal is simply not out there on the market today, nor available currently in the projections for tomorrow. But all actors involved in the voluntary carbon market today really need to be stepping up to the plate and putting their investment in now to make sure that the removals that they will rely on in future to reach their net zero targets will indeed be available. And it's been really interesting to see since the release of the original principles in 2020, there has been an abundance of these different approaches that have come to light. Whether it's advanced market commitments like Frontier that we've seen, or even the kind of tax credits like 45Q that we've seen over in the US. A number of exciting sector-specific alliances have emerged. And there's increasingly detailed guidance on what it is exactly sectors can do to both decarbonise and then offset the residual emissions, including by our colleagues at the Transition Planning Task Force. At the same time, there's been this growing range of nature and biodiversity targets, and this growing recognition that actually nature should be invested in its own right, separate from carbon offsetting. And this also leads to the consideration that, finally, under the international mechanisms, under the Paris Agreement, under Article 6, we've finally seen the shift from net zero as as carbon offsetting as a zero-sum game, where you replace 1 tonne for 1 tonne, to actually recognising that there's some risks in doing that. And so we need to go further and invest in additional beyond value chain mitigation. And finally, it's also important that actors of all stripes adopt and publicise these principles, whether it's governments incorporating them into law, or whether it's companies adopting them into their policies to illustrate their commitment to net zero aligned offsetting strategies. So now that we know the principles, we'll return once more back to our maths equation. And it's clear that there are both pluses and minuses to offsetting. And so I'd encourage everyone to pay attention as our skilled panel weave us through this debate. To come back and to introduce our fantastic panelists, I'll just return to Professor Morsing. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much indeed for this wonderful, excellent overview and pointing to the risks and the rewards, alluding to the debate that's going to happen right now. Please, panelists, can I invite you on the stage here? So it is my true pleasure to invite 4 distinguished panelists here today for you. And I will just briefly introduce them before we dive into the debate. So here I have Sabine Frank. You are the Executive Director of Carbon Market Watch, a non-for-profit Brussels-based advocacy organization with unique expertise in carbon pricing and a track record of policy work in international organizations and the European Union. Carbon Market Watch exists to ensure that carbon pricing and other climate policies cut pollution and drive a just transition towards zero carbon societies. Before joining Carbon Market Watch, Sabine worked for several philanthropic foundations and also has many years of leadership experience in NGOs at the European level. Warm welcome, Sabine. On the other side of the panel, I have Miles Allens, who is known as the physicist behind net zero. And Miles Allen is Professor of Geosystem Science in the School of Geography and the Environment and Department of Physics here at the University of Oxford. And he served on the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and was a coordinating, sorry, Freudian slip here, lead author for its special report on the impacts of global warming on 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. He's the director of Oxford Net Zero, the University of Oxford's interdisciplinary research initiative on net zero. Warm welcome to you, Miles. Kaja, here on my right, Kaja Axelsson, you are one of the lead authors of Oxford's offsetting principles, and she's a research fellow and head of policy and partnerships at Oxford Net Zero, where she leads a team to translate research into resources, policy, and standards for defining and achieving net zero. Kaja has served as a strategic advisor to the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign, and as a lead technical author on the International Standard Organization's Net Zero Guidelines. Warm welcome to you, Kaja. Lydia Sheldrake here is Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative. The VCMI is an international non-profit organization with a mission to enable high integrity voluntary carbon markets and deliver real and additional benefits to the atmosphere, help protect nature, and accelerate the transition to ambitious economy-wide climate policies and regulation. Lydia, you lead the team working on external communications and engagement and collaboration with companies, governments, civil society, and other initiatives involved with carbon markets. And you have a history here also before that at the University of Oxford. So I'm very pleased to have this distinguished panel here on the stage today, and we were sort of thinking about how do we organize this session, and we decided we'll go by 2 rounds. So the first round, our panelists will present their original positions on carbon offsetting. And the second round, 2 of our panelists, our researchers, will switch position, Oxford style, and take the opposite position. So I would now like to invite our first speaker, Sabine, for 4 minutes to answer the question, or respond to the question, is the era of offsetting over? Please.
Well, here's my chance to distinguish myself in timekeeping, 4 minutes. Good afternoon, everybody. I wonder where you all stand on offsetting. Do you all take transcontinental flights happily if you have an opportunity to offset? Do you go shopping and reach in preference for any products that are labeled as carbon neutral? Maybe I have a chance to find out later on. I was asked to answer the question, is carbon offsetting broken? Is the era of carbon offsetting over? I would say the era of carbon offsetting isn't over yet, certainly. It's still a popular concept, but I think it should be over. And carbon offsetting is not just broken because carbon markets are broken and were so broken that there are now strenuous efforts underway to fix them. Offsetting is not just broken because there are a lot of carbon credits out there that lack climate integrity, and they are not just broken because ton for ton offsetting mostly doesn't work in practice. There is a far more fundamental problem with offsetting, and that is that it is linked to this idea of net zero. Net zero was originally actually only a global concept. The IPCC told us we needed to get to global net zero. But the breaking down, the disaggregation of this net zero happened later. This disaggregation meaning that every government, the different levels of government, that companies and other organizations all adopted a net, well, not all of them, but were enticed, all of them, were encouraged, all of them, to adopt a net zero goal. Now, even if this strategy, a net zero strategy, is pursued where offsetting is done in the ideal way possible, and that is with permanent removals, if everybody did that, if everybody offset with these perfect offsets, perfect with the removals, it would mean there was going to be a competition around these removals, which is purely market-based and is not based on the thought of who should actually be able to claim these removals. Removals are going to remain a scarce concept, and there has to be a debate of how they're going to be deployed. And the net zero logic also obliges everybody with a net zero goal to count carbon credits against their emission reductions. And that sets off a mechanism whereby the offsetting becomes the focus, becomes almost more important than the decarbonization. And that is an unhelpful focus. And it brings me to my second point, which is that offsetting leaves the door open to greenwashing. We've heard the exhortations, and the Oxford Principles are not the only ones that make such exhortations of companies and other entities to have a proper decarbonization strategy in place first, and offsetting should only be a minor part of a climate strategy. And it's also widely accepted now that offsetting can't be the only thing you do when you adopt a climate strategy. A climate strategy can't just be based on offsetting. But nevertheless, there are enough actors out there who are happy enough to distract with their offsetting claims from having no or only having an insufficient decarbonization strategy in place. There are also companies out there who knowingly make offsetting claims with carbon credits which are low quality, which are not up to the job of offsetting. And there are even companies who set up offsetting businesses, carbon credit trading businesses, while at the same time lobbying against climate legislation, a huge contradiction. Then I'd say there's a third problem with offsetting, and that is it is actually really, really difficult, especially for outsiders to any offsetting entity, whether this offsetting is legitimate, because it depends on a judgment of what is a residual or what is an unabatable emission at any point in time. I'd say it's in the eye of the beholder. There is no objective way of assessing that for any entity, what is residual at any point in time. There certainly is an information asymmetry that we can't really know. The outsiders can't know as much as the insiders can know. They can't judge, is the decarbonization effort great enough? Is what is claimed to have to be tackled by offsetting truly a legitimate case for offsetting? And although so-called science-based targets go hand in hand with, supposedly with science-based decarbonization pathways, it's not actually the pathways that get validated, it is the targets that get validated. But still, we are left with this uncertainty about what is the legitimate subject of offsetting. And then my final point in this round, where I'm being critical of offsetting, is that offsetting can't be fixed by limiting it to permanent engineered removals. Although I understand the science of it, that the permanent engineered removals are the best suited to offset emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, but it's the mechanism, it's the market mechanism around it that doesn't work, because if you rely on the voluntary carbon market for removals to be incentivized, you get a mechanism whereby those who can pay for them will buy them. And it is only rich actors, especially now, who can buy them. Permanent engineered removals, if you take direct air capture and storage, for example, still cost between $800 and $1,000 per ton. Who can afford that at the moment? It's IT companies, it's internet companies. And that connects to the interesting question of who can actually claim the removals. As I said before, there are all these entities, all these levels of government. They all want to be at net zero at some point. But take the example of the Danish energy company Ørsted selling removals to Microsoft. It might be that initially it's an investment and there isn't a claim straight away in terms of a climate strategy, but it'll get to that point where Microsoft will want to claim the removals. And that then means the Danish government can't claim it, but the Danish government also wants to get to net zero. So there is a problem there. And as I said earlier on, there is also still the problem left of removals will remain scarce. Even with the best effort of scaling them up, they will remain a scarce resource. So there has to be a negotiation around them of who can claim them, what can they truly be used for. And if that is just left to the market, I don't see that working. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much, Sabine, for taking us through excellently here as a kickoff. I'm now delighted to hand over the next 4 minutes to you, Miles Allen, and talk about why we need offsetting. Please.
Well, if we didn't have offsetting, we'd probably reinvent it under another name, and I suspect that's actually going to happen. And the reason we need it, of course, is because we need net zero. We aren't going to phase out fossil fuels in time to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, that's a prediction. I might be wrong, but I think the chances of me being wrong on that one are quite small and getting smaller by the year as we continue to fail to reduce emissions. So once you get your mind around the fact that we are going to be still using fossil fuels, still generating carbon dioxide from fossil sources at the date of net zero, globally, we will have to offset that residual use. It's just as a matter of scientific fact. Whether we call it an offset, it'll have to be compensated for. And you then basically have two choices. Either there's a global carbon removal service paid for by somebody, I'm not quite sure who, people are always a bit quiet on that one, or the remaining users of the fossil fuels pay for it. And I frankly think that the second option is infinitely more just. I don't think it's fair for the taxpayers of the 2050s to have to pay for a carbon removal service when a few people are still benefiting from the continued use of fossil fuels. So if you exclude the idea that the state pays for carbon removal, then you end up with essentially some form of offsetting, that the remaining users of fossil fuels are the ones who pay to dispose of the carbon dioxide their fuels generate. Now the question is whether you can use a market to do this, or how closely. Inevitably, and this is where sort of debates fall apart, markets need to be regulated. A completely unfettered open market in this will always generate the kind of problems Sabine was referring to. But I do think a market in which rich players today are buying durable removals is a good thing, because if you think about the nature of the durable removals we need to buy, particularly, injecting carbon dioxide back underground, disposing of it permanently, it's very close to getting fossil fuels out in the first place in terms of what needs to be done. You need to understand the subsurface, you need to characterize exactly the same rock formations that you probably went hunting for oil for 50 years ago. We're now going to need to hunt them out as places to put CO2. Now, if we decided 50 or 100 years ago that fossil fuels are a precious resource, so we're not going to let anybody make any money out of them, we're going to preserve them, the government's going to own it all. I mean, we might have done that. Maybe some countries did try to do that, and those are probably the countries who didn't really develop a very robust fossil fuel industry, at least very fast, until they privatized it. So, I think if we're going in the same direction for offsetting, we need the market competition to find out, to develop, to drive the enthusiasm of the world's entrepreneurs to actually drive the carbon dioxide disposal industry to scale. Remember, we're going to have to be getting rid of an awful lot of CO2 over the course of this century. I mean, no matter what scenario you pick, it's going to be, hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 is going to have to go back underground permanently. And it's going to take all the ingenuity of the world's geologists to do that, and the best way to incentivize them is to make it the case that if you find good places to put CO2, cheap places to put CO2, cheap sources for CO2, you can make a lot of money. That's how it worked getting the carbon out of the ground. It's how it can work putting the carbon back. But obviously, that's going to have to, it's a market, but it would have to be regulated, of course, particularly because it's a market where you're requiring people to do a service, getting rid of the CO2, so you're going to have very intense regulation to make sure that whatever they claim they're doing, if somebody claims they're getting rid of some CO2 over here, they're actually doing it and not just sort of pumping it in and letting it leak out again. So, if you look over the century as a whole, we are going to need some form of offsetting, because we are going to generate more carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels than we can afford to dump in the atmosphere if we're actually going to meet our climate goals. But if you look again at the century as a whole, the form of that offsetting is pretty much entirely engineered removals, sticking carbon dioxide back underground. Yes, other forms of offsetting can play a role in the transition, but when we come to the second half of the century, that's what's going to be left.
Thank you so very, very much, Miles, for this.
You weren't sure whether to clap that one, were you?
Thank you for clapping also.
That's very polite. Well done.
Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to hand over the next minutes here to Kaja Axelsson, who is one of the lead authors of these principles, and say something about offsetting today is not why it's not zero aligned. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Thank you, Kaja.
I should say I'm a lead author with Professor Miles Allen,
Absolutely.
despite our seating arrangements. So I like to imagine that, say, 1,000 years ago, the people walking these halls were debating whether or not it was credible to offer indulgence credits to those among us who had maybe violated some of the rules of the church. And I like to imagine that maybe they were debating, should we offer these indulgence credits, or should we really address a more systemic problem at its root? And I think this is not so different nor made up than the current voluntary carbon market. I think that there are so many problems with what is being both offered and purchased in the carbon market today that we might think about coming together and addressing the both social and environmental harms at the root level, and that offsetting as a frame could perhaps be seen as a distraction from that. Not more so the deal that offsetting is a problem at the frame level, but I think it is a problem at the credit level, and we need to acknowledge that. What the offsetting market or the credit market sells for offsetting is often no less mystical than the church's medieval indulgence credits. Recent analysis cited in our latest principles, but done by Berkeley, suggests that over 90% of the current voluntary carbon market is overcredited. Moreover, people like Taylor Swift are flying around in their private jets. And I think this is actually a very good sign that we have a controversy at the public level about Taylor Swift's flights. But even if she's buying double offsets, double of nothing is still meaningless for the planet. This broken carbon market persists for a few reasons. First, I think that, like indulgence credits, carbon offsets are generally invisible. It's hard for buyers to easily discern quality. Second, I think the market is largely unregulated. Unlike many other markets that operate well, we don't have robust consumer protection standards. Third, offset developers are guilty of ignoring evidence that their projects fail to benefit the climate. As Upton Sinclair wrote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it. My esteemed colleague and my boss has shared that we need offsetting in order to scale removal and storage capacity. But as Ingi shared with us earlier, there is strikingly little removal capacity in the voluntary carbon market today. Perhaps, if you're taking it at a pure metric, less than 4% of the voluntary carbon market has any removals in it at all. I don't think hardly anybody knows that when they start investing in credits. Analysis based on Berkeley suggests that things are overcredited, but also that the market has not responded to our offsetting principles, much as we would like the word to just follow behind what Oxford says. Offsetting further perpetuates our mass addiction to needless consumerism. Companies with skyrocketing profits continue to emit while making cheap purchases and claims that confuse the public into a false sense of security and keeping emissions up even among the most climate conscious. Again, much like medieval indulgences, the issue is practically philosophical. If something has failed so much on its intended purpose, is it even what we envisioned in the first place? Can we call it offsetting? However, the outcome of this debate is not philosophical at all, but material. The lives of hundreds of millions of people rely on us taking urgent and systemic climate action. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. If offsetting is not working, we must consider other approaches. Rather than replace all of our hopes and, frankly, a tiny voluntary carbon market compared to climate finance needs, we should turn our attention to other ways to both reduce and remove emissions. Instead of keeping the climate guilty, content with their short purchases, perhaps we could collectivize our efforts to demand, as actually Miles suggested, more action from governments to perhaps do blended financing, scale removals, and bring in the demand side pulls that we need to reduce emissions globally. In summary, the era to offset is over. It's time for the onset of a deep and direct sustainability transition.
Thank you so much for that, Kaya. Very good. Finally, Lydia Sheldrick, can we fix this? How do we create high integrity carbon markets, and why are offsets critical to driving investment in those markets? So the question to you is why we need high integrity carbon markets, please.
Thank you, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So exciting news from us yesterday at VCMI. We had the first company making a VCMI carbon integrity claim announced yesterday. And that is after VCMI was set up 3 years ago. So it's been a long process of multi-stakeholder deliberation and collaboration across governments, civil society, companies, and initiatives and experts to detail criteria and a standard for demand-side integrity in the VCM and develop a mark that companies can use to make credible claims. So my answer is yes, I think we can fix it, and we need to. Because carbon integrity claims and this new era of high integrity voluntary carbon markets that it signals represents the use of carbon credits in addition and not to delay or displace urgent climate action. So this actually represents companies taking responsibility for their emissions rather than abdicating responsibility, which is traditionally what we might associate with the term offsetting. So I really think integrity is the watchword now. Voluntary carbon markets must have integrity because integrity builds trust and confidence builds scale. And it's really our focus on integrity at VCMI which has enabled us to steer through this controversy through the past 3 years and build a consensus and a license to operate for a new reformed voluntary carbon market. I think we're at an inflection point now in 2024. There's been huge criticism of voluntary carbon markets last year. So there's a lot of scrutiny, which is needed. Scrutiny is absolutely needed. Now we have the frameworks to embed integrity at the market level between VCMI on the demand side and ICVCM, the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets, on the supply side. We have an opportunity to shift the market and build a framework for action and mobilize demand. This year, we've already had the first VCMI claim announced yesterday. There will be core carbon principle labeled credits on the market, and VCMI will be also launching our Scope 3 flexibility claim. We have a beta version now, and that's to generate more access for companies who are responsible climate leaders to take action now while they are on the pathway to net zero. And there's a whole ecosystem of other tools, such as the Oxford Principles, which can be used in concert with VCMI and ICVCM frameworks to provide additional guidance. So Bain, for example, the company that made the claim, the VCMI carbon integrity claim, also used the Oxford Principles to inform their carbon portfolio approach. That said, I think it's clear that we need to do, as a community, a much, much better job of orchestrating a clear and compelling coordinated message and communications across the VCM's ecosystem and our vision for what good looks like and what action we need to see. Because once we get outside the carbon markets bubble, or even inside the bubble, quite frankly, there is a lot of confusion and noise. Is it reduction? Is it internal decarbonisation or is it credits? Is it reductions or is it removals? Is it compensation or contribution? Is it jurisdictional or project level? Actually, it's all of it. We don't have the luxury to be choosy at this point. We are way off track in climate finance and climate action. So it's an and/or story when it comes to the use of carbon credits, not an either or. So I said it's a yes and story, not an either or. So definitions are really important for transparency. We need to get clear on the words that we're using. At the moment, we use different words to mean the same thing or the same words to mean different things. The term offset itself can be used as a noun or a verb, and it's used in many different ways to refer to different types of action in terms of its use. Definitions are just one element. when we're trying to build trust in a new market infrastructure, that means we need to reassure market actors. We need to win hearts and minds, and that means we need to take into account the connotations, associations, and the emotive element of language. That's equally important if we're trying to build a license to operate in a voluntary system. Offsetting, as Sabine mentioned, has been associated with greenwashing, the act of doing either or and abdicating responsibility for your emissions. And so it's for these reasons that VCMI, when we were set up, moved away from the term offsetting, and actually now we're working on a shared glossary with ICVCM, SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and CDP as part of an end-to-end integrity framework for corporate climate action. So I suppose that's to say that from my perspective and VCMI's perspective, carbon credits and carbon trading is absolutely not dead, very much alive, and we need to do a lot more to mobilize demand and scale up action. But I would move away from the term of offsetting because I think that will make all of our lives much easier in getting where we need to be.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much, Lydia, for this. And thank you, distinguished panelists, for this first round, which is now over. And I will invite you to the second round. So can I ask two of you to actually switch places, our researchers? I will make sure you don't fall here behind me. Thank you. So now in this second round, we're going to be breaking with Oxford debate society tradition, highlighting just how nuanced this debate is. Our two Oxford academics have here switched sides. And Miles Allen will now be arguing kind of against offsetting, and Kaya Axelsson will be arguing kind of for net zero aligned offsetting. So why are we doing this? Well, in universities, we're used to academic disagreement, sometimes strong disagreement. But when this is done with respect and curiosity, this is a true opportunity to learn and to explore the nuances in complicated topics, of which we are one of them debating here today. And what we find is that we often agree on many areas, and in our field, of course, we're always united by the common goal of stopping climate change and building a better future. And as you may know, the Oxford offsetting principles in particular represent a consensus among 17 authors with at least 12 different institutional affiliations. And by switching side, Miles and Kaya are bringing out some of the angles they and their esteemed authors have explored together through the drafting of this piece. So this is with very deep respect, and thank you for taking on this challenge here today. I'm thrilled to be sitting here moderating this kind of debate. So please, speakers, remember, you know, how we do this, and thank you again for in the first round being so disciplined. So can I invite you, Miles, to sort of take a stab on why offsetting is broken?
Okay, yeah, well, Oxford has a long tradition of backing losers as well, from sort of Charles I onwards. So by switching sides, we guarantee that at one point we're going to back the loser. I guess we're also going to back the winner. So there you go. Maybe we should do more of this. But I've got the easier job now, which is saying what's wrong with the current state of offsetting, which is a pretty easy call. There's three, as Kaya pointed out. Offsets at the moment are 95% avoided emissions, 5%, or roughly 5% nature-based removals. Both of these face serious and possibly irredeemable, we don't know, time will tell, depending on the efforts of the VCMI, challenges. Three very important challenges: scale, permanence, and a rather sort of annoyingly technical sounding word of additionality. On scale, the amount of carbon we can either avoid or pay somebody else to avoid emitting or remove into the biosphere is limited. And limited in all the scenarios to a pretty small fraction of the amount of carbon we're going to need to get rid of. So there is a huge danger with focusing on things that we kind of know are not going to work in the long term, but they make us feel okay in the short term and discourage investments in the things we do need to be investing in if we're actually going to achieve net zero in the long term. So there's this dangerous scale that you're doing something that can't scale up to actually solve the problem, but giving everybody a sort of displacement activity, something to do in the meantime, and avoiding us getting started on what we really need to be doing, which of course is getting on with what is suspiciously referred to as novel removals in many quarters. So that's the scale issue. The permanence issue besets both avoided emissions and nature-based removals. Nature-based removals, although we can design nature-based removals to be as permanent as possible, if we're living in a warming world, there's an enormous difference between carbon dioxide disposed of back underground and carbon dioxide that's still on the Earth's surface and safe enough, as long as the owner of the forest or whatever it is that it's stored in abides by whatever covenants were in place at the time the offset was taken. And that they have to abide by those covenants for hundreds of thousands of years, which is a long time for any contract to be enforced. So I think there's a real issue with the permanence of storing carbon in the biosphere to compensate for the undoubtedly permanent impact of generating carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels. That we know has a permanent impact, and we're attempting to compensate for it with something we know is much less permanent. And it's not just the permanence of the individual project you're talking about, but it's what that land that project takes up occupies and what it might be doing to the scarce land we have elsewhere. Another resource that we know is scarce is land. We've only got one Earth's surface to occupy at the moment, and that's why we know that our ability to squirrel away carbon into the biosphere is limited. The permanence issue besets avoided emissions as well, because again, if you've got a cumulative carbon budget, you've got when you're paying somebody to not emit something, you've kind of got to pay them to not emit it forever. If you're going to think to yourself that that's compensating for the actual burning of a fossil fuel yourself. And that again is a difficult concept to enforce. How can you, if I pay somebody to use a more, anyway, you can see where you need to go on that. Finally, there's this additionality question. How can we be sure that when we pay somebody to not emit in a world where all countries have net zero commitments, they would have been obliged at some point to avoid that emission anyway? So, when the world is heading for net zero, how does it even make sense to say I'm paying for this person to not emit and therefore somehow that's compensating for my continued emission? On the nature-based removals side, the problem of additionality is even more complicated, and I kind of am in danger of running into a professorial lecture here. So watching the clock, I'll just give you in a nutshell, we are counting on the biosphere to take up a huge amount of carbon. 5 billion tons per year at the end of this century, closer to 10 billion tons per year at the middle of this century, just to draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations fast enough to stop global warming at the 1.5 to 2 degrees level. Now, that's the natural response of the climate carbon system to the fact that we've dumped a whole lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in the first place. We need the biosphere to do that. And we can't possibly count that removal, or it's not, we can't count it as a removal, that uptake, I should say, as a removal and pretend it can be used to offset our emissions without the whole net zero accounting falling to bits and net zero emissions no longer actually delivering the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is stopping global warming. Now, the problem is countries are collectively, universally agreeing they're going to insist on accounting systems that count this kind of uptake as a removal. And since there seems to be absolutely no prospect of any country budging on that, the European Union has just decided to count all this stuff as removals. So we suddenly reduced our emissions last year when they did this change in the accounting rules. Okay, so as long as that sort of accounting shenanigans is in play, there's no way we can be confident that carbon stored in the biosphere is actually going to deliver the goals. Carbon storage in the biosphere is actually going to deliver the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it's easy for me to criticize offsetting as we know it, because none of it, only a negligible fraction of it, is actually what we're going to need in the end when offsetting gets reinvented, probably under another name, later in the century, to compensate for remaining fossil fuel use.
Thank you so much, Miles. Thank you. Excellent. So I will return to you, Lydia, for another step at why we need high-integrity carbon markets. Please.
Thanks. So focusing more on the why, so the reality is that climate finance is way off track. We're not in a situation where we're deciding whether we're going to use carbon markets or another tool because we've got loads. We're in a situation where we need to increase climate finance 5-fold annually. That's just to avoid the worst effects of climate change, with the G20 declaring that emerging markets and developing economies need 3 trillion annually by 2030. So the focus on why is about the impact. Carbon markets are a financial instrument. They're not inherently bad. It's a financial instrument that we need to make sure is governed properly. And it's an instrument that can channel finance cross borders from companies in one country to activities on the ground. And there's not many financial instruments that can do that in such a decentralized way. So there's a huge opportunity to channel finance into certain sectors which other financial instruments find hard to reach, benefit people and communities on the ground, indigenous peoples who preserve 80% of the world's biodiversity, for example, and help leverage other forms of finance. It's important to say that, Miles, I think you mentioned NDCs. NDCs at the moment are not ambitious enough, and even those that we have, there's a major funding gap. So why we need voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets more broadly is to provide a part of the solution. They're never going to be a silver bullet. It's not that carbon markets are going to swoop in and save the day and we don't have to worry about anything else. They are one part of the solution, but they can be significant, especially in certain sectors and places. So the question which is posed is offsetting broken? I actually think the question is, climate finance is broken. It's not delivering, climate finance systems are not delivering finance to where it needs to be, and the policy isn't working. And I know it's tempting to say that the answer to all of this can be regulation. Just implement regulation, that's the answer to integrity. But the reason that we're in this mess is because there's an absence of policy and regulation. So it's not necessarily going to be so easy to just click your fingers and bring that into place. And so that's where the voluntary carbon market comes in. It's not broken, it was never properly built. There's a lot that we can learn from the last 15 years of activity, but it's always remained niche. So it's a maximum just above $200 million. And what we're talking about is building a professional market infrastructure with capacity in place, financial integrity, as well as environmental integrity and social integrity, so that we can scale that up. And there's some estimates suggest that carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, could be worth 50 billion a year by 2030, which is significant, but it's still only a fraction of that 3 trillion by 2030. So it's just one piece of the puzzle. And by doing so, by building high-integrity voluntary carbon markets, we can help to accelerate the pathway to regulation. It actually helps us progress on that path, rather than expecting regulation to fix it outright, because voluntary standards of best practice provide a framework for regulators to incorporate into policy, and they also build up a constituency of support and a sort of a license for policymakers to embed those elements into regulation and compliance. So one recent example is from the TCFD disclosure rules, which I know several people at this Oxford Martin School were involved in since the outset. So there's a pathway here And ultimately, it will be, that's what we want to move towards, and we should all be calling on governments to do so, and to be holding companies accountable for the net zero transitions and drive scale to the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Excellent. Sabine, second round, why the era of offsetting is definitely over. Definitely over.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with that question and sort of say what the new era holds, or what the key elements of the new era could be. I first have to state again that offsetting is a claim. It is not the asset that is being traded, and that's an important distinction. So we can talk about carbon markets and carbon credits and how their integrity can be increased, and that's all very important, but what I want to talk about is how the claims associated with buying those assets can change. And there is an alternative to offsetting, which I think is significant. We initially called it making a climate contribution to take responsibility for any emissions that you can't offset yet. It's also now known as the concept of beyond value chain mitigation, and you're probably familiar with the Science-Based Target Initiative. They're due to come out with guidance on this subject very soon, and Carbon Market Watch is also going to contribute some materials here. Now, why beyond value chain mitigation, or why make climate contributions instead of offset? I would maintain it's simply a far more honest way of going about your decarbonization strategy. It's not trying to make up a calculation towards net zero, which is practically impossible to make. The key first step in moving away from offsetting to making a climate contribution is to separate your targets. And that should apply really everywhere. It should apply at the government level. We're fighting for it at the European Union level at the moment, but it should also apply to companies. It would be much more honest if every company set themselves simply a clear emission reduction, a clear mitigation target, and publicize that. And then, in addition to that, made a declaration of what they're doing with the emissions that they cannot abate as yet. So a separation of targets and climate contributions, I think, are the way to go. Now, I come back again to this distinction between offsets and carbon credits. I'm not trying to argue that the era of carbon markets is over. They can be reformed. I wish every effort that is underway a lot of success, and carbon markets can be a tool for buyers to support a global net zero rather than their own net zero. When I hear that the Oxford offsetting principles still stick to this idea that offsetting should be limited to offsetting with removals, I have one worry, and here actually I share an opinion with Lydia. We didn't coordinate what we were going to say beforehand, and that is that carbon markets also serve the purpose of providing climate finance, especially for the global south. And although there are countries that are now putting their bets also on producing credits with permanent technological removals. Kenya, for example, in Africa wants to go that way. It says it has the ideal geological conditions to also store carbon permanently. But I should think it will remain exceptional. Most countries in the global south are still looking for support with their emission reduction efforts, or with their efforts to look after forests, after rainforests. And these are all things that are also valuable to support. And the purchase of carbon credits by Western companies, say, is still legitimate to support those aims. And if beyond value chain mitigation becomes more widespread, then with that, carbon markets also have a legitimate growth potential. We still have to be cautious about the role of carbon markets and any hypey announcements about their growth potential, but I still say they have a legitimate growth potential. My final point in this round is that with all the efforts underway, in particular to enhance the integrity of carbon credits and the projects that generate them, there is still much more to be done. In particular, we still need much more transparency on financial flows. There are often very optimistic statements about how much money is the carbon market makes flow, but it remains questionable. Does it actually flow to the people on the ground who are involved in the projects that generate the carbon credits? The volume concerns the trade as a whole, which can include many sales and repurchases of carbon credits. It doesn't say how much money is going from the end user of a credit to the generator of a credit. And there are loads of intermediaries involved, and we have very scant data on their profit margins and the fees that they take. And the second point that also will have to change is eventually prices in the carbon market for carbon credits of the various kinds have to rise. They're still ridiculously low in many cases, and as countries, as communities and as countries where carbon credit generating projects are hosted wake up to the income potential and ask for their fair share out of this trade, the prices will have to go up, otherwise there aren't enough benefits to share around from everybody who legitimately wants to have a piece of that cake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kaja Axelsson, I will hand over to you to let us know how we can fix offsetting.
I'm not sure I'll do that either. And Sabine, I was going to say, I think you've done a very good Oxford student exam by reframing the question. I think that's a classic move. So I wanted to follow your thread and your reframe because I think it was important. It's perfectly cogent to examine offsets separate from credits. And the carbon market may in fact have different purposes. And I'm looking at a co-author of ours in the back who absolutely made sure that in this revision of the Oxford offsetting principles, we made that point, that there may be very many reasons that people might invest in the voluntary carbon market or a compliance market for that reason, towards perhaps separate nature targets, towards a desire to kind of support the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and that even credits around avoided emissions may have a role to play even beyond kind of the net zero target date. And so we have in fact highlighted that, to acknowledge that we were trying to help organizations with their net zero strategies as a very narrowly defined approach to our principles, but there may be other purposes. It would be interesting to do some analysis, and I'm looking at Ingi now, as to how much of the market is in fact driven by this frame around offsetting and how much is not. But I think the word offsetting has become so mired with controversy that leading standard-setting organizations, perhaps including Lydia's, have started using different words and frames to describe how they deal with residual emissions. Miles actually predicted that would happen, and it seems to be happening. The Science Based Targets Initiative calls it neutralization. The ISO Net Zero Guidelines call it both offsetting and counterbalancing. But today, and not just because I swapped seats with Miles, I have to say that we should embrace controversy and call a spade a spade. Offsetting by any other name would still be as critical and in need of our critical care and attention. Whatever we call it, many organizations will still need to compensate their final emissions in particularly hard-to-abate sectors by the net zero target date, and no amount of reframe or calling it something else changes that fact, or the fact that, as has been pointed out many times today, we have to scale removals capacity 1,000 times by 2050. Perhaps years ago, I was born the year that the UNFCCC was formed. It might have been safe to say that we can keep warming to reasonable levels by reducing alone, but ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how many more rooms of scientists have to say it. We've screwed up that plan. We're already far past that point. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And if we continue to assume that the world will reduce emissions fast enough, then we're digging ourselves a hole that may become increasingly hard to dig ourselves out of. All IPCC models show that carbon removal will play, and I say all, that's a lot, show that carbon removal will play an important role. The degree to which it plays an important role depends on our mitigation scenarios, and we're not doing a good job on that front. Consider the last industry that scaled 1,000 folds in 2 decades. It probably needed, I think, as Lydia pointed out, all the tools at its disposal to test things out. While there are certainly other ways to finance and scale carbon removal, as I have argued on the other side, offset purchases are one central frame where we already have targets, net zero targets across the entire world kind of signed up. We should be using that and holding them to that account. Many companies in the hardest to abate sectors, based on current models, will have some residual emissions they need to get rid of. This means that some of the world's most powerful organizations have already committed to spending this money. We should make sure that they do. If we don't, we're suggesting that the taxpayers should spend that money. Public financing might not be able to do it alone either. Governments are going to get increasingly squished in terms of their priorities as they adapt to climate change. This is also something where I think the controversy could help us. I'm a political scientist and a community organizer, and controversy is where political tension happens, and out of political tension comes reform. This is no longer a debate relegated to the techno-bureaucratic among us. It is a debate at the dinner table and among Swifties. Finally, looking at Angie, finally, if organizations take seriously what it takes to offset in line with net zero, as we've suggested with durable and long-term storage, then this will make it very expensive to commit to net zero, and they may actually just consider that mitigation or replacing things with heat pumps is cheaper. An internal carbon price that reflects the true cost of actually cleaning up your mess is part of a net zero aligned offsetting strategy. That's a point that Miles convinced me of many years ago and why I still work for him, among many other reasons. Certainly, fixing the broken market and correcting current practices will require advancements in regulation, as we've discussed today, and consumer protection laws. I think and I hope they're on our way. Our new policy hub will be tracking that. But if we don't start building integrity by leveraging the private sector to pay for removals today, we're essentially asking our taxpayers to do it for them. So, while I agree with my peers that the era for false offsetting must absolutely be over, I fear that we must lean into and not give up on one of the most powerful potential levers of climate accountability at our disposal for carbon disposal.
Thank you so much, Kaya. Just want to say, here towards the end, thank you so much, distinguished panelists, for an informative, a courageous, enlightened, excellent debate here at the table. And time is now up. We had actually, when we were planning, hoped that we were sort of thinking maybe we should have 2.5 hours rather than 1 hour and 15 minutes, but we were afraid that you may not, sign up to come here and join that. We will continue, and I would love to invite you outside, just to the right here, for a drink to continue the debate. But before we do that, I will just say that, such a debate, usually here at Oxford, ends with a vote for the winner of the debate. We're not going to do that tonight. Instead, we think that you learned something new, and we hope that you learned something new and better understand this very complex, contested, yet essential topic that we bring to you here today, and then we hope that we all have won. So if you would like to speak more with our speakers, please join us for a reception outside. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you.